Hello and welcome back to the Conclusion of the Matter podcast. I'm Ren Ferguson, and joined with me is Robbie Santiago. But we do not have Ryan Weaver this week. We fired him off of the podcast. No, just kidding.
Lack of attendance.
Yes, yeah. No, it was just logistics. Everything got in the way, schedules, conflicting schedules and everything, living so far away, it happens sometimes, and so we're going to be knocking out a few without him, but he should be back on for the last at least 4 episodes of the season, I think, and so, but that's why he's not here. He's fine as far as we know. Everything's fine, and so...
It's just not like he lives 5 minutes away anymore.
Yeah.
So a little more difficult.
Yep. And so since he's not here, we're going to keep doing what we always do. As Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14, let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. If you have any questions or comments or topic suggestions, please feel free to email us at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com, and we'd be happy to work those into an episode or maybe dedicate an entire episode to the question that you may have. And we're always interested in looking at the things that you all would like to look at. So if there's anything that you would like for us to discuss, please let us know. But I guess I'll hand it over to Robbie.
Oh, thanks, Ren. So we're actually going to continue a series that we have periodically gone back and forth with from time to time, called Know Your History. And we've gone throughout earlier parts of the Old Testament, but today's podcast is mostly going to be about the book of Ruth. And you may recall the last Know Your History was leaving off with the book of Judges. We had gone through the books of Joshua and Judges. And in previous podcasts, not necessarily in this series, we've covered Genesis and a few of the early books, bits and pieces as well, but I believe we started with mostly kind of Joshua and Judges.
Start with Joshua, because most people generally are kind of familiar, especially with Genesis and Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to get into some of the historical things that maybe people aren't too familiar with.
Exactly. I thought we had started with Joshua as well. I just didn't want to, have the wrong thing on record here. But all of that to say, if you do want us to dedicate to some of those previous books, then leave a comment or send us an email at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com, and we can throw those in whenever we have time as well. But today's is going to be about the book of Ruth, which kind of overlaps with where we left off with the book of Judges. And we actually happen to know that pretty quickly, because if you read the first verse of Ruth chapter 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land." So it already kind of gives us a breakdown of the time period. So about the time that the book of Judges is going on is when the story of Ruth picks up. And I have a few maps. We're either going to put this in like a video stream or just as an attachment that you guys can look up along with this podcast. But I have a few that kind of show the different kingdoms at the time, and the Middle East and where most of the Bible tends to take place can be a really confusing area, because there's a lot of different kingdoms that most of which we have heard of but don't really know or couldn't identify on a map. Groups like the Hittites and the Assyrians, and even the Israelites to a degree as well. And so I was just going to include some of these maps in, I guess, not archives, but as an attachment of some kind that you guys can kind of view to follow along with the podcast if you'd like to. Because when the Middle East and Mesopotamia originally started, you had a different set of groups than at the time of Ruth. And so in 4000 BC, you had Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. Flash forward even a few hundred years, and that's going to be drastically different. In fact, I have some dates with here. 1800 BC, some groups that you may be familiar with. The Egyptians were starting to come on, of course, but you had the Amorites, but then you still had the original Babylonians, not talking about the Chaldeans, King Nebuchadnezzar. That kingdom hadn't come on yet. But then in present-day Turkey, you would have had a group called the Hittites that's mentioned a few times in the Bible. And many of these also have archaeological evidence. I can't remember when we did our podcast about the proofs of the Bible if we brought this up. But the Hittites, I believe, were one of the groups that people had claimed that the Jews and the Christians just made them up until they discovered archaeological evidence, and it turns out we were telling the truth the whole time. But anyway, if we flash forward to 1500 BC, the Babylonians are still kind of around. Their kingdom is, in fact, growing a little bit, but then some of the kingdoms look a little bit different, and even Egypt's become a little bit stronger. But there's a few other groups that have kind of come onto the scene then, and I believe this also would have been the rise for some other kingdoms as well. But I wanted to flash forward particularly around 950 BC as getting pretty close to when the story of Ruth is. And I put two maps in the archives. One of them is 950 BC and one of them is 830. And the last page will look something like this that kind of gives a really detailed breakdown of particularly where Moab was in relation to the kingdom of Israel and Judah, because at that time you also had the divided kingdom as well. So you had two different kingdoms, if you will. But if you cross over to the east, then the kingdom of Moab was directly east of Judah, but then kind of southeast of the northern kingdom of Israel. When those two were the united kingdom, then I guess you could say Moab was either east or southeast, though. But anyway, anything you wanted to?
Well, I was just going to add in as far as the timeline goes. For one, we do know roughly when this took place. It just says during the days of the judges.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the internal things in verse 2, it talks about how the man and took his wife from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. It is speculated that it's possible that the events of the book of Ruth took place during the days of the very first judge, Othniel, because that was when the Moabites had come in and they had kind of not conquered the entirety of Israel, but at least in portion.
Sort of occupied
it. And so it's possible that it's during that time that Ruth comes on the scene and all of these things transpire.
Yeah, and that was the point that I was going to bring up too. And a good way to think of, especially, I guess we should have possibly brought this up when we went through the book of Judges particularly, but when other kingdoms would come in, I think a good analogy would be kind of like Reconstruction in the South, where they were like other, not foreigners, I guess, in the Reconstruction sense, but there were different military personnel or different kingdoms that were there to kind of supervise things. And at times they would be oppressive, and at times, a little bit less so. But I think an important point is that for a good bit of the history between Israel and Moab, I wouldn't consider them to be necessarily allies, because as I was mentioning in relation to the maps, there's so many different kings and kingdoms and groups that are occupying generally this same area. And Mesopotamia is just a portion of what was known as the Fertile Crescent, which is kind of a portion of the whole Middle East. But it was called the Fertile Crescent because the farmland was very fertile. But outside of that area, it was all desert. So this is what we would call prime real estate. And so you had all of these different groups that were competing for this prime real estate, this prime farmland, and for resources and for power in this area. And that's why there's so many different kingdoms that come and go, is because they're all fighting for the same thing. And one conquers another, and then another one will come in and conquer, and then another one might migrate to the area and cause tension. There's alliances that get formed, wars that happen. So there's, just like there's been in recent history today even, there's just a lot of different groups that come and go in this region. And there's very seldom one group that's ever going to dominate this area. It's really just divided and fragmented, and they're all constantly at war. So just like today. Anything else before we dig in?
I was just going to mention real quick that the Moabites were the cousins of the Jews. They were the descendants of the incestuous relationship that Lot had with his daughters, and Lot was Abraham's nephew. So these are the cousins, the Moabites. So Ruth is kind of related to the Jews, yeah.
And I think that's an important point to make. So the Moabites are going to be different than another group, like let's say the Amalekites.
Yeah. There's no relation.
There's no relation, and they're kind of like bitter enemies, for lack of a better way to put it. The Moabites, sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't, because they did have some relationship to a degree and some lineage there. But again, these groups are still fighting over for power and for resources and for territory and everything else. So I wouldn't say that they're, allies or friends necessarily either. But the relationship between Israel and Moab, I think, is important context here. And it mentions in chapter 1 the relationship between Naomi and Elimelech. So we'll read verse 2 there. Well, I guess I'll pick up in verse 1 just for context. Now, it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man in Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Euphrates of Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to live in the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. So essentially in the first few verses here, you have Elimelech, who was kind of the blood relative of the Israelites, you could say, and his wife Naomi as well. But then when her husband Elimelech passes away, her 2 sons marry women of Moab. And so they weren't direct Israelite blood lineage, which generally was, I guess what you could say, ideal for marriage at that time, because the Moabites didn't necessarily believe in God as the only God necessarily. And so there's a little bit of a difference of religious background and also obviously cultural backgrounds as well. But anyway, the 2 sons married Ruth, and I always read this and almost say Oprah.
Yeah.
But Orpah.
Orpah. I always think of a whale, like orcas.
Orcas, yeah. I didn't think of that first, but it reminds me of that too. But yeah, I always think of Oprah because of like the close spelling.
If you were dyslexic, you probably would say Oprah.
Maybe I am. I don't know. But anyway, those first few verses, Naomi not only loses her husband, but shortly after that, she also loses both of her sons as well. So it's pretty much left with just the ladies. And if we were to continue in at the end of chapter 1 there, I'm not going to read all of this, but essentially what happens is Naomi tells her 2 daughters-in-law, however you pronounce that phrase.
Yeah.
She tells them that, they can go their way and, remarry, go back home, be with their people and stuff. And there was a verse that I was going to pick out. It may take me a second to find it here, but essentially this was kind of what I was getting at about the religious differences, that it kind of indicates that the Moabites would have worshipped at least a different god or different gods, and chances are they were polytheistic because most of the likely, ancient world was polytheistic, and usually those weren't the same gods either. Anything you've got while I dig up this verse here?
Are you thinking about verse 16?
That's kind of close to where I am.
Where Ruth tells her that your people will be my people and your God, my God.
That wasn't the one. Naomi's actually the one that says it. I'll see if I can find it here. Anything you wanted to add kind of about that, or talking to the daughter-in-law or daughters-in-law?
No, not necessarily.
Can't find it now all of a sudden.
I think you pretty much hit on it.
But
But one thing I was thinking about is with Ruth coming even from that polytheistic background, I'm not sure. I guess she would be considered a proselyte since she is not a direct relative, a direct descendant of Abraham. And then since she kind of converted to Judaism for the sake of Naomi, I guess she would be considered a proselyte in that, which I think is very important for what comes at the very end of the book as well.
Right. Yeah.
Did you ever find the verse?
No, but I found it last night, but I should have written it down. But anyway, I don't want to stall over that, but I was just bringing that up to point out that chances are that their background was probably in polytheism or just a different god altogether, because why would Naomi tell them to worship, their own god or gods if it wasn't specifically the same one? So anyway, I guess we can go on to chapter 2 unless you had something else here. Okay. Chapter 2, we kind of have a change of scenery because they pretty much return home because Ruth, also an important point, the book of Ruth is primarily about her loyalty to Naomi, because even though Naomi had the daughters-in-law to go back to their people, Ruth chose to stay with Naomi because of all of the hardship that Naomi had just experienced, and then so she kept that loyalty. Obviously, none of them at that point were married because their relatives had just passed away. But Ruth decides to stay with Naomi, and that's also not to say anything negative about Oprah, but about Orpah.
Well, never mind. I'm not going to say that.
But just the choice that she made was a very noble one to stay and care for her mother-in-law, even though she clearly had not no reason to, but she wasn't being forced to do it. She chose to do it. Yeah. But then she meets Boaz. It says in verse 1, there was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered him, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, "It is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. So basically, Boaz was another blood relative, particularly through Elimelech, and not necessarily Naomi, but Naomi by marriage. Yeah. And so essentially Ruth goes to glean in the field, as it says, and both of them are kind of like, well, they don't know who each other are. Another important context thing here as well that we're going to get to later is that this is the ancient era, and the ancient era wasn't particularly known for women's rights, let's say. And so most of the wealth and most of, anything associated with land or all of that generally wouldn't be owned or managed by women at the time because it was a very patriarchal society. So we'll probably get more into that later, but all of that to say is when Ruth and Naomi moved back, they pretty much had close to nothing. Yeah. And that may have also been part of why Ruth decided to stay with her, not because she didn't have anything, but because Naomi wouldn't have had anything going back home too. And so to just kind of be a hand of help to her mother-in-law, she decided to make that move back. Yeah. But neither of them had a lot when they returned.
Yeah. And I think that's evident there in verse 7 where she says, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." In the law of Moses, there were certain parts of the field or what was left over from the reapers was to be left so that those people who were poor could come in and reap that and they could have something to eat then. So that would indicate exactly what you're talking about there.
And I think it could not even, I was going to bring that up about the poor, but I think also, that was kind of showing the status of women at the time too. Because, women probably, correct me if I'm wrong, wouldn't have been allowed to go at the same time as the other male reapers.
Well, and I think as we get into chapter 2, I mean, unless you're ready to go on, whenever her and Boaz actually meet, and she ends up gaining favor in Boaz's eyes because he had heard of everything that she had done for Naomi. He tells her, where does he say it? In verse 11 is where Boaz addresses what she had done for Naomi. And then...
Are you talking about 14 maybe? That's kind of what his response to her.
Yeah, well, it was where he told her to keep gleaning in his field, because he had told his men to not do anything to her, and if she had gone into another field, then she might be assaulted. I know Naomi says that to her at the end, but I thought that Boaz had said something.
For some reason, I think that may be in 3 also. Anyway,
okay.
We can go ahead and kind of continue. That's
because
all
that kind of goes to your point about the women's rights and roles in society. I mean, if she were out there by herself, if the person who owned the field wasn't a good person, she could have been abused.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think we should probably go ahead and continue, but yeah, let's go ahead and do that first before I start commenting on things, so that there will be a little bit of context to look at here. We left off in verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close to my young women. Let your eyes be on my field, which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." So basically, he's like protecting her, knowing that there could, be people that try to take advantage of her in different ways. But what I was going to bring up a second ago is, and a lot of this is, based on the ancient era culture of the time. It's not, that we're not indicating our value of different people. This is just the way that it was back then. But when she returned, she didn't have no money. She would have been a poor class, and she would have been a woman in society, and she would have been not from that country. So essentially what we would consider an immigrant in a sense today. So those 3 things were not very high on the social ladder at the time. So and she kind of checked all 3 of those boxes. So if it were kind of like anybody else, they would have been like the bottom of society, with the exception of, maybe if they had slaves at that time, because almost every civilization had slaves at the time, and they were all at the bottom of society because they were prisoners of war and such. Anyway, anything before I keep going here? Verse 10 says, "She fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, 'Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?' And Boaz said to her, 'It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge.'" So pretty much what you said is that, he had heard of all of the good things that she had done. So character. Essentially. Verse 13, "Then she said, 'Let me find favor in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants.' Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, 'Come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar.' So she sat beside the reapers and passed the parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied and kept some back. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. Also let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her.'" So pretty much, and we'll kind of see this for the rest of the chapter, and even Naomi will kind of reiterate sort of some of this as well. But he basically says to all of his servants, people that actually anybody that would have been socially above Ruth, he basically tells them to treat her kind of equally or as good, or treat her, very well, which again, but based on the social status she's coming in, would not have been a common thing at that time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting in verse 16 where he tells his servants to not only allow her to glean, but then he even says in verse 16 to take some from the bundles and leave it for her.
Mm-hmm.
So like to make sure that
she
they're
has
going
some
to
of the
have
good
what
things
she needs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know if this is the point that that's really to be made here, but it is kind of that symbolic almost that she took care of her mother-in-law and showed that loyalty, and it's kind of now being repaid to her in a different way, but kind of that same principle. But anyway, the rest of the chapter, she basically has a conversation with Naomi about what had just taken place, essentially. And Ruth explains her everything that happens pretty much. Anything that you wanted to really add at the end of the chapter there? But then we get into chapter 3. It says in verse 1, Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Now Boaz, whose young women you are with, is he not our relative? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself and anoint yourself, put on your best garment and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in, uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Anything you got on that?
Just from what I could tell about the uncovering of his feet and lying down at his feet, from what I could tell is that was a cultural thing to show subservience or submission. And so she's kind of just giving herself to Boaz. And then what Naomi says, and he will tell you what to do. Basically, she's saying, I'm gonna do what you tell me to do, Boaz.
Right, and I pretty much had the same note on that it was just kind of a cultural sign of like submission, humility, and just service to him. Okay. Anyway, verse 6 through verse 9, she pretty much does that. But verse 10 is his response. Then he said, Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning, and that you did not know, or that you do not go after my young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. So really a sign of her character. But I think this is one of those stories where we all understand what happens here, but her character must have been, head and shoulders above everybody else, and how like she served those around her, including Naomi and including Boaz in this case, just because of the extent that he's going to go to here. Yeah. And he brings up that, she basically hasn't done anything related to like his servants or anything. I don't know if he's talking about that in, that she's like not hitting on them or anything, or just that, just in a general sense that she's like treated them well, or that she's been just respectful in any aspect of that situation. So, but anyway, unless you had something, we can
that's good.
Keep going here. Verse 14. So she lay, I left off a little bit before then. Verse
11, maybe?
Yeah, verse 11. And now my daughter, we've left off with 11, so I'll pick up at 12. Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a closer relative than I. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good, let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. Essentially, there could have been a closer relative. This is all kind of, the Jewish customs at that time.
The ESV actually uses the word redeemer instead of close relative, which I think helps make that connection a little bit clearer. Because the redeemer, I think you were about to go into it. You can go ahead.
But yeah, I was just going to say, since they were essentially like from another country, but they would have been, again, ancient world, kind of like the responsibility of the males in that lineage. So Elimelech originally.
Right.
But since there were no blood relatives, that close, since the two sons had died and everybody, now it was just to the closest relative, which is going to introduce here soon. But essentially there's one other that's closer in relation than Boaz is. And he basically says, if this guy's not going to redeem you or, pay for that, if he wants to, great. But if not, then, I'll take that responsibility on if he doesn't want to.
Yeah. I was just going to add, too, that this custom that we're seeing play out here is what the Sadducees come to question Jesus about the resurrection, where they say this man is married and he dies, but he doesn't have a son or a child. And so she goes to his brother. Well, that was the custom. If a man died childless, then his wife or his daughter or whoever, they were supposed to go to the next relative, and he was supposed to have children for his brother or his kinsman. And so what he's saying here is, yes, I'm your relative, but there's another one that's in line in front of me. So let's see what he wants to do about it first.
Exactly. Anything, I was just going to jump to chapter 4 unless you had something about the ending of the chapter there.
No.
Okay. All right. Verse 4 is kind of continuing that. In verse 1, it says, Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, Come aside, friend, sit down here. So he came aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city, witnesses, and said, Sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the close relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, Buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am the next after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem the right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. So it seems like he's on board until you bring in that
Ruth comes along with it. Yeah.
And he's like, I'm not going to put my own reputation or my own, inheritance or because that's how, again, if you weren't a direct blood relative, for the way the custom was at the time, it was kind of a black mark almost.
I also read that possibly what he means by this is, because Boaz, I think in your translation at the beginning of chapter 2 says that Boaz was a wealthy man.
Something like that, yes.
I read somewhere
great wealth,
where it's possible that whoever this is wasn't as wealthy as Boaz. And so what he's saying is, if I were to marry Ruth and have children, well then Ruth gets all of that inheritance of Elimelech, and then I'm going to have to split the remainder of my inheritance with these other children. And basically, he's worried that it might financially ruin him if he were to do this and then have children with Ruth on top of everything.
It may be a collection of both of those things too.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, so...
the important part is
he's starting to back out, so he cannot redeem it for himself. Verse 7, Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was confirmation in Israel. So that's basically what happens between these two.
I think we should bring back that custom.
Honestly, I
don't
even...
Take our shoes off and hand it.
I was going to say, if it's sandals, I've got like maybe one pair of sandals.
No, we can just do shoes.
So, yeah. Honestly, it may keep people a little bit more honest, though, on their word. But anyway, so basically the middle part of this chapter, Boaz keeps his word, ends up marrying Ruth, and, all of the inheritance and things that are associated with that. Even if we were to go down to verse 11, and all the people who are at the gate and the elders said, We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whose Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord give you from this young woman. And then the ending of the chapter kind of goes into, basically the descendants of Boaz and Ruth, particularly the very end. Verse 18, it doesn't give the whole genealogy, but the kind of contextual genealogy. The genealogy of Perez begot Hezron, Hezron begot Ram, Ram begot Amminadab, Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon, still very controversial. Salmon or Salmon begot Boaz. Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. So Obed was Boaz and Ruth's son, and so eventually Jesse and then David would be born through the lineage of Boaz and Ruth. So that's another important part of her story here, is that David and the rest of the lineage of Jesus eventually would come through this Moabitess woman, Ruth.
And I think that's probably one of the major reasons, outside of the practical things that we learn from Ruth herself. That's probably one of the major reasons why we have this recorded, is to show the lineage of David, to track all of that.
Right. I'd agree with
that.
that.
For the coming of Jesus specifically.
There's a lot of like moral lessons that we could look at, her loyalty, her commitment, her, love and compassion for not only Naomi, but also Boaz. And you can see that that's mutual throughout the book here as well. But historically, if we're going to know our history, this book's here historically so that we can kind of see another example of the genealogy here, specifically through Ruth and Boaz, that is eventually going to give us King David, and then eventually through that lineage, Jesus. And I think I didn't write it down, but I believe this same lineage is brought up both in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew as well, and probably other places in the Old Testament, but specifically those two. So, okay. Anything else you wanted to add? So we've hit Joshua and Judges. Ruth happens kind of while the book of Judges is going on, most likely kind of at the beginning there as well. Well, Moab is kind of related to the story. But these groups didn't always get along incredibly well. But this is kind of another layer to their history and their relationship as well. But in the end, a story for good. So if you have questions about this podcast or other podcasts or ideas that we could do in a future podcast, then feel free to email those to us at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com. But make sure to share this with your friends and family and coworkers and anybody else that you think it would be valuable to. We hope that you've enjoyed this study like we have. We say this a lot, but we enjoy kind of doing this, not necessarily for our own benefit, but, we like to, hopefully help you guys out in your biblical knowledge and your walk with God in some way. So we hope that we've been able to do that. But historical context can be an important thing, and sometimes we know it but don't really take a deep dive into it. So hopefully we've been able to glean a little bit on that for you today. Anything else, Ren?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, I guess then for the book of Ruth and the history thereof, you can consider this the conclusion of the matter.